Hello, I am Rabbi Howard Goldsmith, and I am joined this evening by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ira Ebbin. Hello, Ira.
Hi, Howie. How are you?
I'm doing okay, even at this late hour. This week we are continuing our conversation about Pikuach Nefesh, the Jewish obligation to save a life, and the high value that Jews put on life. And we're actually going to explore this question by looking at the end of life and how we deal with those really fraught questions when we've reached the end. Ira, you've got a great text, a story to tell us from the Talmud that will help serve as a jumping off point for our conversation. Please.
Right. So the text that we found is from Ketubot 104a, which you can see right over there. And here it tells the story of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi passed away. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was the great leader of the of his generation, one of the great Jewish leaders of history, and the author of the Mishnah. And he was referred to as Rebbe because he was such a great teacher. And the Talmud tells the story that when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was dying, they decreed a fast and begged for the rabbis decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy that he would not die. And they even said that everybody has to do this. Anybody who doesn't comply and pray for Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's recovery or that he doesn't die will be stabbed by the sword. That would be a terrible thing. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had a maidservant who was a very wise woman. And she saw, she describes that she sort of had this feeling that the upper realms were requesting the presence of Rebbe and the lower realms were requesting the presence of Rebbe, and felt this tension of the heavens and earth below of how they were doing, of keeping and sustaining Rabbi Yehuda and Rebbe, who would take him. But then she noticed, and she prayed for the lower worlds to succeed and triumph. But when she saw that how much suffering Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had gone through, specifically dealing with his phylacteries, that it just pained him so much to go through every just basic simple steps of putting on his tefillin, his phylacteries, then she said she prayed actually for mercy that the heavens should succeed and triumph over the rabbis below. And when she saw that she was not successful, she went to the roof and she threw down pots and pans, and it made this big noise. And because of this boisterous noise, the rabbis who had been praying for Rebbe to stay alive got distracted. And at that moment, Rebbe died. And so here we have this story of Rebbe's maid who had mercy on Rebbe and sort of helped his demise, helped his death come to fruition. How do you want to tackle this?
I do. I do want
Okay.
to tackle it.
Well, it's funny you should be here.
Just so happens. It's one of these crazy Talmud stories that seems, on the one hand, very far-fetched, that if you gather enough people around praying loudly enough that you can keep somebody alive who otherwise would die in that moment. And it seems crazy a little bit until we think about the scene in a hospital today, around the bed of a loved one near the time of death. And perhaps rather than the prayers, I think that perhaps the modern day equivalent are the heroic measures that doctors and nurses will go through, usually at the insistence of the family, in order to keep somebody who is terminally ill, who is very near to death, in order to keep them alive. And they involve lots of tubes and machines and often a lot of pain and suffering for the person. And just like this maid had the recognition that this praying should stop and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi should be released, so too is it something that we need to consider. At what time do we stop that praying? At what time do we stop the heroic measures? The Reform movement has a point of view on this. Rather than a specific set of guidelines, it has more of a framework that we use to think about it. And it's really, what is the goal of medicine? The goal of medicine is to provide comfort and to extend life, to make life as healthy as possible. And once the medicine stops serving its purpose, once it is no longer serving its therapeutic aims and goals, it is time to stop the medicine. Now, of course, there's endless debate about when that moment is, about when exactly the medicine stops being effective. But by having that framework, it allows for a dialogue between the family and the patient and the doctors that allows them to make this decision for themselves. based on their goals, based on their therapeutic goals, based on the technology as it is. I've been blessed to be part of these conversations, and it's a high honor to sit with a family and a loved one and the physicians and to help think through these questions. And this Jewish guideline that the medicine should be there to serve a therapeutic purpose, to enhance life, to make life worth living, has always been a very important part of those conversations. So at times I wish I had a simple guidebook. Do this, and then it's time to stop. But I've seen a real holiness evolve and a real sacred moment as families have these conversations.
So Howie, we're in this field, right? And this is something that we, the rabbi at the hospital bed and dealing and helping families during these difficult times. That's our bread and butter. That's who we are. That's what we do. And I've had, of course, experience with this just as you did. And I actually did an internship in hospice care for a while and providing spiritual care at really end of life. So we've seen a lot. We've seen a tremendous amount. And I agree with you, to watch the pain and suffering and the challenges that families go through and patients go through is something that's very difficult. But at the same time, and this is, where we discussed last week, that we find differences between the Orthodox movement and the Reform movement, where I can't just talk about generalities. I need to know principles. I need to know, what am I supposed to do now? What does God want me to do now? And when you have when you're bound by halakha, it's obviously nothing's black and white, but it's much clearer. As we talked about last week, the framework is very clear. So just to understand, we have a biblical obligation of rapeh rapeh. The Torah tells me very clearly that I'm supposed to biblically obligated to provide medical treatment for anybody who's sick, who needs medical treatment. We do, however, take into consideration pain and suffering. And so at what point does the pain and suffering override the biblical obligation to provide medical care? And at what point can I say that I'm allowed to end a life? This is not just stuff we could just joke about. This is not stuff that we could just take abstractly and say, how about this? How about that? How about that? These are life and death issues. This is it. This is, we answer to a higher authority. How do I know what is the right thing or the wrong thing? When does life end? And the answer is where we're clearly guided by Jewish law and Jewish tradition. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of the great leaders of the last generation, passed away in 1986. He said that we're always required to provide three basic things, no matter what, under all circumstances: food, hydration, and basic oxygen. We're always required to provide that. We don't have to do heroic measures. We don't necessarily even have to resuscitate, or one can perhaps sign a DNR or a DNI, do not intubate. But those basic needs are required. Even if the person, we say there's nothing left of them, there's almost nothing left, they're dying, I still have to provide that. We also have to take into consideration that every moment of life is valuable. We were put in this world against our will. Who is to say that we're allowed to leave this world based on who decides when we leave this world? It's a very difficult thing. And when you talk about, I don't mean to diminish what you're describing, but when you talk about these life and death issues, if I don't have a guideline, a halakha of what I do, I don't know how I would be totally lost.
So let me ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
If we're obligated to provide oxygen, doesn't intubation often provide that oxygen?
Basic oxygen.
Basic oxygen?
Basic oxygen basically means that what they put in the nose, that it wouldn't be required to provide oxygen by respiration, by respirator, or things like that. So basic oxygen.
Right.
That's how Rabbi Feinstein defined it. Now, Rabbi Feinstein defined this he passed away in 1986, so he defined this 25 years ago, 30 years ago. But nonetheless, that's the basic principles that we stick with. Those are our guidelines that we stick with. Of course, with new medical technology, there's always new things to discuss and bring up. And that's why there's often even within the Orthodox world, there's a a range of opinions on how much heroic measures are you required to or not required to. But
Uh-oh. Ira, I seem
you
to have
there?
lost you.
I'm
Oh,
back.
there you
Oh,
are. There you
okay, I'm back. See,
Okay.
I haven't gone to the light. It's something that we take very seriously, and we have strict guidelines because who's to say whose life is it? Who's to say that we're allowed to end somebody's life? You know, there's an act. You might say that something you're doing is an act of benevolence, an act of mercy, and I could call it an act of murder. You know,
Right.
when Terry Schiavo years ago, when they took away outer feeding tube, so people thought this was an act of mercy. I defined it based on Jewish law. Jewish law said that was an act of murder.
An act of murder because you were taking away the feeding tube.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think we come at this, from the same root, but I think we come at it a little bit differently. I think that the reform approach allows for perhaps more up-to-the-minute understanding of where medicine is in this moment. And it also allows, and actually, I don't want to compare it necessarily because I'm operating in a different paradigm in some ways. The thing that I like about the reform approach is that it's able to take into account the needs of the patient, the needs of the family, the opinions of the various doctors, and a number of other kind of circumstantial information that might change an outcome. One example for that might be an experimental cancer drug. An experimental cancer drug that that a 95-year-old may not choose to take because he feels that he's lived a good life and he's ready to go. But that a 45-year-old cancer patient might choose to take, even if it may not provide the hoped for outcome. And so we're able to have this conversation with a bit more flexibility, but still maintaining, and I think, of course, this is what we share, the true sanctity and holiness of life, and holding that highest, always highest.
Right, but I don't disagree that heroic measures. I mean, there are those who will disagree with me on this as well, even within the Orthodox world. But heroic measures aren't always necessary. That there are certain points where you can, as Rebbe's wife said, you can call it a day. We've done everything we can. Yes, they might have had what we call chaye sha'ah, a few more minutes of life of suffering, but we don't require that. But A, it's supposed to be passive, and B, it has to have certain basic it has limitations. People want to die right, and we've had this conversation. Maybe we have different conversations. People, you say that they want to do what they want. A lot of people want to know, what should I do?
Right.
And it's really a very difficult time, and there's a certain comfort knowing what the law states.
There's no question about that, and not just here. Ira, I'm often jealous of Orthodox Jews because there is a lot of clarity. Because very often the law says this is what you do.
Right.
And it doesn't require some of the wrestling that I do with my congregants, where I know a lot of the laws, I know most of the laws, but then to have to sit and wrestle with them, it's very complicated. And so I'm very jealous of that. Kind of the certainty that you're provided. It doesn't work for me intellectually.
I understand.
But
I will tell you that
jealous of it.
There's a phrase, and we can end here because I'll get the last word. But there's a phrase that we say in the prayers. It's in the Uva L'Tzion prayer that we say every morning. Baruch Hu Elokeinu shabaranu lechvodo v'hivdilanu min hatoim v'natan lanu Torah emet. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who created us in His honor and separated us from those who are to'im, those who are lost, and gave us the true Torah. Without the Torah, I'd be lost. I try to make the right decision, but I wouldn't know. And here, because I have the tradition and the Torah and the framework, yes, I'm able to go to sleep at night knowing that I believe this is what God wanted me to do under these circumstances. As difficult and as troubling as it was, at least I knew that I was given the framework to know what to do.
Right. And I would say that I echo the sentiment, and I feel the same way, but from more of a philosophical sort of a guiding perspective, as opposed to the concrete specifics all the time.
Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm okay with you being jealous of me. It's fine.
Okay, that's good.
You have better hair than I do, so it's
Okay, Ira, thanks a lot. Have a great night.
You too, Howie. Take care.